Good day, everyone. This is Sir Franz, and welcome to our lesson on the anatomy and the physiology of the kidneys. This will be our topic outline. Let's begin the lesson with anatomy of the kidneys. And we answer the question, where are the kidneys located? First, the kidneys are described as retroperitoneal organs. So, first, you have to remember that the peritoneum is a form of serosal membrane, which means it has two layers, a visceral layer and a parietal layer. And think of it as a balloon, which is invaginated by the abdominal organs, majority of which are found in the gastrointestinal tract. So that would mean that the stomach, the small intestines, in particular the jejunum and the ileum, as well as the large intestines, in particular the transverse colon and the sigmoid colon, are coated by one layer of the peritoneum, and that is your visceral peritoneum. Okay? And after the visceral peritoneum, there is a potential space that is filled with fluid. After that, there would be the parietal peritoneum, which is found on the abdominal wall. So, when we use the term intraperitoneal organs, we are referring to organs that are fully coated with peritoneum. And again, those intraperitoneal organs are the organs of the gastrointestinal tract, including the liver and the spleen. So, when we say retroperitoneal, we mean that the kidneys are behind the peritoneum and they are in themselves not coated entirely by the peritoneum and do not float inside the abdominal cavity, in contrast to the intraperitoneal organs, which technically are floating inside the peritoneal cavity. So, the kidneys are retroperitoneal and they are more related to the posterior abdominal wall. You have to remember that the abdomen has a wall made up of skin, fat, and the abdominal muscles. That wall, where you will find the rectus abdominis, will continue posteriorly to become what we call as the back. Okay? So that posterior abdominal wall or the back is where the kidneys lie on top of. Okay? And after the kidneys, there would be a layer of peritoneum that partially coats the kidneys. So with that anatomy in mind, we can therefore say that the kidneys are related to the posterior abdominal wall and they are behind the peritoneum or retroperitoneal. The kidneys are located on each side of the spine or the vertebral column, and the right kidney is lower than the left. Why? Because the right kidney is being displaced inferiorly by the liver, which is found on the right side. So because of the liver, the right kidney will be located at the level of the 12th thoracic vertebra up to the 3rd lumbar vertebra. That is a little bit lower than the left kidney, which is located at the 11th thoracic vertebra up to the 2nd lumbar vertebra. And again, the key point there would be the presence of the liver, which displaces the kidneys inferiorly. This picture shows you the relative anatomy of the retroperitoneum. So in front of this would be the peritoneum, which contains the intraperitoneal organs. Okay? The stomach, the small intestines, the large intestines, the liver, and the spleen. So in this picture, the abdominal wall, which is this one, has been cut away, and the peritoneum, together with the intraperitoneal organs, also have been cut away. And so what you see here would be the retroperitoneum. And you will see that the kidneys are retroperitoneal organs. And you will observe that there is a gland on top of the kidney, which is this one. And this is what we call the adrenal gland or the suprarenal gland. Ad meaning on top of. So adrenal on top of the kidneys, or suprarenal on top of the kidneys. So the right suprarenal gland is triangularly shaped, while the left suprarenal gland is crescent in shape. Okay? The right kidney is nearer to the vena cava, and the left kidney is nearer to the abdominal aorta, which are these two great vessels of the abdomen. And this is your diaphragm, and that means that on top of this would be the heart already. Okay? So, what does this mean? The right renal vein would be short because the right kidney is near the vena cava, whereas the left renal vein would be long because the left kidney is far away from the vena cava. Similarly, the left renal artery would be short because the left kidney is near to the abdominal aorta, while the right renal artery is long because the right kidney is farther away from the aorta. Okay? And you will observe in this picture that literally the kidneys lie on top of the muscles of the back. Okay? So this is your quadratus lumborum. And here would be the psoas muscle. These are muscles of the back, okay, which serves as the bed of the kidney. This picture shows to you the retroperitoneal location of the kidneys. Okay, so this plastic-like layer on top of the kidney, this one where my cursor is, would be the parietal peritoneum. So you have to observe here that the kidney has never entered the peritoneum. Therefore, it is retroperitoneal or at the back of the peritoneum. Similarly, other retroperitoneal structures are the duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestines, as well as the pancreas. Okay? And you will observe here that the right kidney has close relationship with the C loop of the duodenum, so that if there is injury to the kidney, right kidney, the C loop of the duodenum can also be injured. And similarly, the head of the pancreas is also related to the C loop of the duodenum. Whereas the left kidney is related to the tail of the pancreas. Okay? And again, this bare area right here, that is a carved out portion of the parietal peritoneum, would be the space where the liver is attached. And you now understand from this picture that because of the presence of the liver, the right kidney is displaced inferiorly. This picture shows you the relationship of the right kidney and the left kidney with the vertebral column and their relationship with the back muscles. So in this picture, the skin and the subcutaneous fascia of the back has been cut away so that the muscles of the back are exposed. Okay? And you will observe here on the right side that if we cut away the muscles and we are approaching the structures from posterior to anterior, we will already see the kidney if we cut away the quadratus lumborum muscle. Okay? Upon which the kidney lies on top of. Okay? So you will also observe here that the left kidney is related to the 11th vertebra, while the 12th vertebra, which is this one, is related to the right kidney. And again, this is because of the liver that displaces the kidney inferiorly. Next, how are the kidneys, blood vessels, or vasculature organized? Um, it, it is similar to the general arrangement of blood vessels in the human body. The arteries will branch and become smaller arteries until they become capillaries, where gas exchange and substance exchange, nutrients and wastes occur. And the capillaries, after performing that function, because of its thinness, will fuse with one another to become veins. And the veins, as they approach the heart, will fuse with other veins to become bigger veins. So, in the kidneys, within the parenchyma or the substance of the kidney, you will also observe this general scheme. Artery becomes capillary, capillary becomes vein. From the renal artery, it branches into progressively smaller vessels, and you have to take note that the arteries within the kidney are segmental arteries and they are end arteries. What does this mean? Those arteries do not have connections with other arteries. So what happens? If you block that artery, that segmental artery, because it does not have connections with the neighboring segmental arteries, the portion of the kidney that is supplied by that segmental artery which has been blocked dies off because it does not receive blood. And why does it not receive blood? Because there is no communication with the other arteries. Okay? Much like what happens in the heart. So, the coronary arteries of the heart muscles are end arteries in themselves. Blood that has passed through the renal capillaries then drain into renal veins, which are organized in a similar fashion as the arteries. Okay, so here I want you to appreciate how the main renal artery branches off to become smaller arteries that supply the substance of the kidney. So your renal artery will first branch off into an anterior and posterior division. Next, the anterior arteries will branch off into segmental arteries. And you will observe from this point that the segmental arteries do not have connections with the other segmental arteries. Therefore, they are called end arteries. And if, for example, this artery is blocked, all of the segment of the artery, okay, the portion of the kidney that it supplies will also die because it does not have collateral circulation. Okay, so the segmental arteries will then become interlobar arteries, and interlobar arteries will then become arcuate arteries that arch over the renal pyramids. So this fleshy material right here would be the renal pyramids. So this is where urine will be collected and will go into the collecting system and pass into the ureters. So again, this would be the renal pyramids. And what would be related to the renal pyramids? That would be the arcuate artery, which arches over the renal pyramids. From the arcuate artery, what will branch off would be interlobular arteries, these smaller arteries. And the interlobular arteries will be the ones that produce the blood vessels that feed the glomerulus. Okay, so let's recap that. Main renal artery, anterior and posterior division of the renal artery, segmental artery, interlobar artery, arcuate artery, and the smallest one would be the interlobular artery. I want you to remember this one because later on, the interlobular artery, which are these smaller branches, will actually produce the arteriole, which means it's already microscopic, that feeds the glomerulus and allows the filtration of blood. Okay? So next, you have here the collecting system. Okay? So this would be calyces. And the calyces would contain the urine that has been produced by the nephrons. Okay, and the urine will go here into the pelvis of the kidney, and from the pelvis, the urine would go into the ureters, which will conduct the urine into the urinary bladder. Okay? Next, you will appreciate from this picture that the kidneys have a fibrous capsule. So, technically, para siyang merong nakakover na balat. Okay? And this fibrous capsule has been cut and peeled back to expose the substance of the kidney, which is the parenchyma of the kidney. Next, you will also observe from this picture that the renal pyramids actually indent themselves into the calyces. Okay, so para siyang mayroong tip. The renal pyramids have a tip, and from this tip, urine will flow into the collecting system and continuously down the ureter. Okay? You will also observe from this picture the relative arrangements of the structures here in the renal hilum. So this kidney, as you will observe, has a little bit of a C shape. Okay? And the concavity of the kidney, of the C shape, is what we call the renal hilum. Okay? So from the renal hilum, the anatomy of the structures would be from anterior to posterior, the renal vein, the renal artery, and then the ureter. So anterior to posterior, again, renal vein, renal artery, and the ureter. Next, you will also observe that the renal hilum is filled with a lot of fat. Okay? So this is your perirenal fat, the yellow structures here. Let's now go into the physiology of the kidneys. What are the functions of the kidneys? Filtration of plasma and the formation of urine. So first, you have to understand and remember again that blood is made up of a liquid component which suspends the formed elements or the cells of the blood. So the cells of the blood include red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. And they are in themselves suspended into the fluid portion of the blood, which is the plasma. That fluid portion contains nutrients, wastes, hormones, and other substances that are to be eliminated and metabolized by the liver and the kidneys. So those wastes have to go away from the body. So the question is, paano natatanggal from the body yung mga wastes na yon? That would be the function of the kidneys. It will filter the plasma, and in the process of filtering the plasma, parang nag-filter ka sa lab using a filter paper. Similar, no, ang process na iyon. As you filter the plasma, the product of that would be urine. Okay? So, in the filtration of the plasma, the body removes from the plasma what the body does not need. And as that filtrate goes along the tracts of the kidney, what the body needs, the kidney will pick from the filtrate and return into the plasma, which we will talk about later. Next, you have maintenance of blood pressure. The kidneys, because they are sensitive to changes in blood pressure, will maintain the blood pressure. So whenever the blood pressure goes down and the blood flow going into the kidneys goes down, what happens? The kidneys will start to release renin. And from our previous discussion of the cardiovascular system, that renin will serve as an enzyme which will convert angiotensinogen to angiotensin. And angiotensin 1 will be converted to angiotensin 2, which will become a vasopressor substance. It will constrict the blood vessels and increase the blood pressure. Okay? The kidneys also control blood pH, so that the pH of the plasma and of the blood is maintained at 7.4. If the blood pH is less than 7.4, that means the blood is acidic. And if the blood pH is more than 7.4, that means that the blood is basic. And so, with changes in the blood pH, you will also see changes in the function of the body, which is deleterious to the body. So, what does the kidney do? If there is excess acid in the blood, it throws away the acid into the urine. If there is excess base in the blood, it throws away the excess base into the urine, so that the blood pH is maintained. Next, as we have discussed in prelims, the kidneys are also important for the regulation of the formation of red blood cells. Whenever the amount of oxygen that is delivered into the substance of the kidneys goes down, the kidneys will be able to detect that the level of oxygen or the oxygen tension has gone down. And in response to that decrease in oxygen, the kidneys will secrete the hormone erythropoietin, which goes into the blood and goes into the bone marrows and stimulates red blood cell production. And lastly, as also what we have discussed in prelims, whenever the levels of calcium in the blood goes down, the parathyroid glands will release parathyroid hormone, and that parathyroid hormone will affect the kidneys so that the enzyme which activates vitamin D becomes active in the kidneys. And you will form vitamin D, which will allow the small intestines to absorb calcium and increase the calcium in the blood. Next, how does the kidney do those functions? That would be the role of the nephron, which is the functional unit of the kidney. So you have to understand that the nephron is not a cell, but a tissue, which means it is made up of a lot of cells that work together to perform a specific function. It is made up of highly specialized epithelial cells, very unique and very advanced epithelial cells that are capable of modifying the plasma as it becomes filtered. So as it modifies the plasma, kukunin niya kung ano yung kailangan ng katawan at ibabalik niya sa blood, and itatapon niya kung ano yung nasa blood papunta sa ihe. As it does that, urine is formed. Okay? So, please take note of these parts because this will be essential to the life of a pharmacist. The portions of the nephron. First would be the corpuscle of the nephron, which is made up of the glomerulus and the Bowman's capsule. The glomerulus is a blood vessel, okay? And the Bowman's capsule is already part of the specialized epithelial cell system, which collects the filtrate. Next, proximal convoluted tubule, loop of Henle, distal convoluted tubule, and lastly, the collecting ducts. So again, let's memorize the 5 parts or segments of the nephron. The glomerulus Bowman's capsule complex, the proximal convoluted tubule, the loop of Henle, the distal convoluted tubule, and the collecting ducts. When we use the term proximal, again, we are referring to a structure that is near the starting point. When we use the term distal, we are referring to a structure that is far away from the starting point. And when we use the term convoluted, we mean that the structure has a lot of kulot-kulot. Okay? So pag sinabi nating proximal convoluted tubule, ang tubule na yan ay kulot-kulot at malapit sa simula. Pag sinabi nating distal convoluted tubule, ang structure na yan ay kulot-kulot at malayo sa simula. Okay? So, please remember that because it will look like this. You have here the interlobar artery. And again, where does the interlobar artery come from? From the segmental artery. Segmental artery, interlobar artery, arcuate artery, interlobular artery, and then from the interlobular artery will emerge the afferent arteriole. This afferent arteriole will branch continuously to form a net-like structure or ball, which is called the glomerulus. So technically, the glomerulus is a capillary. Okay? So because it is already capillary, the thickness of the walls will be only 1 cell thick. It is very manipis. And so the plasma will exude from the capillary wall and become filtrate. Okay? From the glomerulus, it will reform not a vein, but another arteriole, okay? Which is called the efferent arteriole. And therefore, what happens here? Artery, capillary, another artery, and then it will become another capillary. So you have 2 capillary systems, and that is what we call a portal circulation. Okay? So next, the Bowman's capsule, right here, will collect the filtrate, and the filtrate will flow from the Bowman's capsule into the proximal convoluted tubule, into the loop of Henle, into the distal convoluted tubule, and then into the collecting duct. From the collecting duct, it will go down and down, which receives all the urine formed from the other nephrons until it becomes the renal pyramid. So this later on becomes the renal pyramid, which again is collected by the calyces. Okay? So from this picture, you will also appreciate that the loop of Henle has 2 parts, a thin part and a thick part, as well as the relative locations of the nephron. You have a nephron that is near the cortex or the surface of a kidney, and you have a nephron that is far from the cortex. Okay? Next, what are the 3 processes of urine formation? The 3 processes are glomerular filtration, tubular reabsorption, and tubular secretion. In glomerular filtration, plasma filters through the glomerular membrane and enters the Bowman space. Okay. Next, in tubular reabsorption, the filtrate is modified so that anong ginagawa ng katawan? It reabsorbs what it needs and throws it back into the blood. Water, salts, and nutrients. Okay, so that's tubular reabsorption. Next, tubular secretion is when the substances that are in the blood are pumped into the filtrate to join the urine and hence are removed from the blood and the circulation. So later on, after all of these processes are done, especially in the collecting duct, you will end up with the finished product, which is urine. Okay, so again, you have here the glomerular capillaries and blood flows here, and the fluid portion of the blood, which is the plasma, is filtered and it becomes an ultrafiltrate, and it goes into the duct system, and whatever the body needs, it will reabsorb. That's tubular reabsorption. And whatever the body does not need, it pumps into the urine. So those are the three processes. Glomerular filtration, number 1, tubular reabsorption, number 2, and tubular secretion, number 3. Okay. So, hindi lang naman basta-basta ang glomerular filtration. It will select which substances are able to enter the Bowman space. And how does it do that? Because of the structure of the glomerulus. You have a blood vessel portion, which is the endothelium, and then you have a basement membrane, and then you have the epithelium portion, which is the podocyte. So these structures right here control what is able to enter the blood. Okay? And the nature and the success of that filtration depends on forces. So there is a little bit of physics here. Okay? Look at this. This would be the endothelium of the glomerulus. So there are holes so that fluid will be able to enter. But these holes are small enough so that red blood cells will not be able to pass through. Actual cells will not be able to pass through the endothelium. And so, if you see in your urine, there is the presence of red blood cells, unless you are menstruating as a woman, that is abnormal. Okay, because the fenestrations or itong mga butas na ito are small enough so that blood cells will not be able to pass through. Next, the basement membrane is negatively charged so that any negatively charged protein will not be able to pass through the basement membrane. Again, because it is negatively charged. Like repels like. Okay? And so, if you find in the urine protein, which is usually negatively charged, that is abnormal because it should not have been able to pass through the basement membrane, which is negatively charged. Okay? And you have here the structure of the glomerulus in better detail. You have the afferent arteriole, the glomerulus, and then podocytes, which form filtration membranes, and you have the space. This Bowman space is where the filtrate collects and the filtrate enters the proximal tubule. Okay? Next, the filtration depends on pressure. So, there is pressure that pushes the fluid into the Bowman's capsule. That is what we call the glomerular hydrostatic pressure. And you don't need to really remember this one. Okay? What you have to remember is that there is a net pressure of 10. So that, what happens? Even if there are a lot of things that are occurring in the glomerulus, there is always a net positive pressure of 10, which means fluid will always be going into the Bowman's capsule. because the pressure is positive 10. How do we get the positive 10? There is a force that pushes the plasma into the Bowman's capsule. That is your glomerular hydrostatic pressure. However, there is a force that pulls the blood from the capsule back into the blood. And what is that pressure? That is the pressure from the proteins of the blood. That is your osmotic pressure. So 60 minus 32, that will be 28. Okay? So there is a net force of 28 on the blood side. However, because of the fluid that is here, this fluid will actually push the fluid back into the blood vessel. That is your Bowman's capsule pressure, and that has a pressure of 18. So you have a net pressure of pushing blood towards the Bowman's capsule of 28, but there is also a pressure that pushes back the plasma 18 into the blood. So that's 28 minus 18. You have a net filtration of 10. So ano pa rin, mapupush pa rin yung blood, ang plasma papunta sa Bowman's capsule. So meron ka pa rin ihi mapoproduce every time. Okay? Next, the nephron houses highly energetic cells that will pump solutes out of the filtrate into the interstitium and back to the blood. So, ano mangyayari dito? There are processes in the cells of the proximal, distal, convoluted tubules, the loop of Henle, that will take the solutes out of the filtrate, pump it back into the blood. Okay, so ganun lang talaga siya, no? And that is a way by which the body prevents very low levels of the electrolytes. Majority of the solute and the water reabsorption occurs in the proximal convoluted tubule. So that we call or label the proximal convoluted tubule as the workhorse of the nephron. Lahat halos ng ginagawa ng nephron, ang proximal convoluted tubule ang gumagawa. Okay? Next, the thick ascending limb of the loop of Henle. Remember, the loop of Henle has two parts, a thin descending limb and a thick ascending limb. That thick ascending limb will pump solute out of the filtrate. Kukunin niya yung asin from the solution, but it will not take the water away from the solution. So, kung sa chemistry, sa general chemistry ninyo, tinanggal niya yung solute at iniwan niya yung solvent. So what happens to the solution? It becomes dilute or unsaturated or hyposaturated. So, because of that function, the thick ascending limb of the loop of Henle is what we call a diluting segment. So, yung filtrate na nandun is already dilute kasi kinuha na yung asin. Next, kung ano yung natira from the loop of Henle, the distal convoluted tubule reabsorbs the minority of the sodium, the chloride, and the calcium left in the filtrate. Okay? So here you have the cells of the proximal convoluted tubules. Look at it, matambok talaga sila. They are very big and they have a lot of mitochondria. And that is because they need a lot of energy to reabsorb the sodium, the chloride, the bicarbonate, the potassium, the water, the glucose, and the amino acids. However, contrast that to the cells of the thick ascending limb of the loop of Henle. Ano ang nire-reabsorb dito? Sodium, chloride, potassium, calcium, bicarbonate, magnesium, pero walang water. So, ano nangyayari? Dahil nire-reabsorb niya yung salt, hindi niya nire-reabsorb yung water, the solution here in the lumen becomes hypoosmotic, okay, or diluted. So next, you have here the mechanism of solute transport in the distal convoluted tubule. So please take note that your thiazide diuretics which are medications that we use to treat hypertension, work on the distal convoluted tubule. So here you have the urine side, and here you have the blood side. This would be the cell of the distal convoluted tubule. What happens? There is a pump called the sodium-potassium adenosine triphosphatase pump that is here in the blood side of the membrane. It will remove the sodium from the inside of the DCT, distal convoluted tubule cell, and pump it out so that the levels of sodium here would be low. On the other hand, it will pump the potassium from the outside back into the inside. So what is the goal of that? The inside of the distal convoluted tubule will be low in sodium, so that whenever this doorway opens, the sodium chloride channel or co-transporter opens, because there is already low sodium here inside, the sodium that is in the urine will go inside because of diffusion from high concentration to low concentration. Okay? So, what happens? Because of this mechanism, you have a way of reabsorbing the sodium that could have been lost through the urine back into the blood. And that sodium will increase the blood volume and increase the blood pressure. So, anong gagawin natin? Inhibit natin itong channel na ito using your thiazide diuretic. And so, you have no way of reabsorbing the sodium. If you can't reabsorb the sodium, the blood volume will not go up and the venous return will not go up, the cardiac output will not go up, and the blood pressure will not go up. Okay? Next, napapansin nyo ba na kapag ikaw ay natulog na, hindi ka na gigising para umihi? But, pag ihi mo, kinabukasan, sobrang strong ng amoy because it is very concentrated. How did it become very concentrated? The kidneys reabsorb the water that could have been there in the urine and pump the water back into the blood. That action is due to the function of the antidiuretic hormone. So, what happens? Antidiuretic hormone is secreted by the pituitary gland whenever the plasma osmolarity is high. So, think of it this way. When the plasma volume goes down, so kung yung solvent mo sa dugo bumababa, nagiging concentrated yung dugo. Okay? Kapag naging concentrated yung dugo, yung pituitary gland mag-release siya ng antidiuretic hormone. That antidiuretic hormone will go into the kidney and it will cause the cells of the collecting tubule to express mga daanan ng water which we call aquaporins. So the aquaporins will already be available into the apical membrane of the collecting tubule whenever antidiuretic hormone is present. And what happens? The water that could have been in the urine, because the aquaporin is open, will go back into the cells of the nephron and go back into the blood. So ano nangyari? Tinanggalan mo ng tubig yung ihe at binalik mo sa dugo. Therefore, naging concentrated yung ihe. Okay? So, kaya mong hindi uminom ng water kapag ikaw ay natutulog na. So, what happens here? Your arginine vasopressin or antidiuretic hormone binds to its receptor and there will be a lot of chemical reactions. But at the end of the day, the vesicles which contain these purple rods of aquaporins will then become available into the urine side of the membrane. And whenever these channels are open, water from here will enter here, and water here will enter here. So that water from the urine will now go back into the blood. Okay? So that will be our lesson for renal anatomy and physiology. Thank you for listening.